Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Mark Pritchard, The Four Worlds. Okay, Mark Pritchard. This is one of those names that, I thought I didn't know about as much as I did. See, 2 years ago, this guy came out with his first album under his own name, Under the Sun, and I skipped out on it. Thought he was a newcomer with not much under his belt at the time the album came out, and since he didn't have much under just his own name, Mark Pritchard. But boy, was I wrong. As I discovered not too much long after, I realized that he is actually one half of Global Communication alongside Tom Middleton, who have one of my favorite albums of all time with 7614. Given how their output is relatively small and disorganized across several aliases, I always kind of envisioned 7614 as a one-album wonder. It just came from this group who didn't really have much else to their name and then kind of disappeared after this album came out. Mark Pritchard, though? God, I've been sifting through Discogs for quite some time with this dude. Not only is he a part of Global Communication, he's in a collective called Harmonic 33 with Dave Brainworth. He did a once-off EP with Kirsty Hawkshaw under the name Pelusia. He released an album with Steve White under the name Africa High Tech, along lots of other various collabs, and solo stuff as well under various aliases, including Harmonic 313 and Link, the latter of which I recognized as being one of the names attached to the Artificial Intelligence 2 compilation. I mean, I didn't actually think Artificial Intelligence 2 was anything special, personally, but whatever. Point is, Mark Pritchard is far from a newcomer. Just so happens that his discography, both by himself and with Global Communication, is such a mess of aliases that it was not obvious to me initially in 2016 how much credit this guy probably deserves. But even with the knowledge of who the guy was, for whatever reason, I still kind of skipped out on Under the Sun. Probably because by that point I felt like it was too late to do a video on it and I'd gotten, no requests to talk about it. I mean, I still only got, one person asking me about Mark Pritchard for this follow-up here, but I kinda wanted to do this one regardless of whether or not anyone asked me about it. I'm obviously not gonna do an in brief segment since I can't really keep track of all of his work that easily, but I did finally listen to Under the Sun in preparation for this review. What an interesting album that was! Seemed to mostly be a homage to earlier Tangerine Dream circa Stratosphere or really early Kraftwerk circa Ralph and Florian, feeling like everything came out of the 70s or something. It was particularly low-key and spooky, and the guest features were not exactly nobodies either. Obviously had Tom York, which I'm not sure why that didn't raise some red flags when I first saw the guy. But it also has Bibio, it has Beans from Antipop Consortium, it has Linda Perhax, and it has Kirsty Hawkshaw. That album was great. It was very nice. But this isn't a review of Under the Sun, it's a review of his follow-up, The Four Worlds, which has half the amount of tracks and about half the length as well, and labeled as a mini-album. Not nearly as eye-popping guest features, has Gregory Whitehead and someone called The Space Lady, but I'd not actually heard of either of those previously. Feel free to yell at me for those if you're a fan. So, how does The Four Worlds fare? It's cool, I guess. I liked Under the Sun a fair bit more, though. I think there's some cool ideas in this one, going for a similar feel to that album, but building on it and adding other things to it. It sounds like maybe a bit more modernized in some areas than Under the Sun, which again sounded like it came out of the 70s, and that was kind of what I thought brought that album more of its charm. But maybe because of all these various mishmash of elements, it doesn't feel quite as special as a result. It's certainly a weird album, but not weird in a way that I personally found to be particularly mind-blowing. So yeah, a bit disappointing that I have to do this, but whatever, let's talk about it. So when you look at the track listing, you can see one track that sticks out like a sore thumb right from the get-go, and that being the 11-minute opener, Glasspops. It was certainly the track I was looking forward to the most, and while I like it, it's maybe not as interesting as I'd hoped. Pretty simplistic techno rhythms going across this thing with percussion textures that heavily remind me of Jean-Michel Jarre's first couple of albums. Might even possibly be sampled from Equinox or Magnetic Fields for all I know, as well as endless fuzzy synth chord progressions going on over it. Certainly the most energetic track on here, and I do still find it fun to listen to, but there's really not much else to it other than what I just mentioned. And it doesn't seem to mesh well with the sounds of the rest of the album, which seem to mostly be going for the same sort of experimentalism and vintage sound that Under the Sun went for. You do have some good ambient passages like the spooky and melancholy Circle of Fear, the sparkly, almost 60s-esque The Arched Window, which covers itself in tons of synth harpsichords. You got Parkstone Melody 2, which does seem to combine some of those like spooky early jar synth textures, especially that one whistling sound, presented in this really minimalistic and haunting fashion, and eventually combined with some smoother pianos later on. So that was a really good one. Men and Toll, or however you say that, I probably got that wrong because it's I don't know. It's a decent little dramatic interlude with expansive synths imitating organs, and the title track and closer here is especially dark and atonal and creepy. These are all pretty cool tracks, they work well for what they are. They're nice, atmospheric, add to that antiquated sound that Pritchard is going for. Though that leaves us the two tracks with guest features, Come Let Us with Gregory Whitehead and SOS with the Space Lady. The former was cool when I first heard it, but got less interesting with every subsequent listen. Gregory Whitehead just kind of says the same mantra repeatedly, and the way that Pritchard glitches up his voice while providing some interesting details to keep me from getting bored, I'm not sure are the best fit for this kind of album. It's such a modern sounding technique on an album that I didn't think was really trying to sound all that modern in the first place. I'm sorry. I mean, the title track from Under the Sun did some similar stuff, I suppose, with some stutter edits, sort of. But first of all, it was editing a sample from 1972, I think, and second of all, the editing sounded like it could have conceivably been from those earlier times before digital editors made it possible to edit things on a more microscopic scale. Nitpicky, yes, but it felt kinda jarring, personally. And the Space Lady on the track SOS basically feels like a low-rent Laurie Anderson to me here. I mean, again, it was an interesting addition here on first listen, but just didn't hold up that well to repeat listens. Eventually starting to feel a little repetitive, since I could pretty obviously point out where the influence lies. It didn't feel that fresh either. Now, all of these seem like pretty small nitpicks to an otherwise pretty solid release, but my biggest problem with The Four Worlds is that it seems unfocused, and I'm not really sure what Pritchard was really going for on this. It suffers pretty heavily from having Under the Sun right there to compare it to. I mean, that album, I don't know if it was precisely a masterpiece, but I can't think of anything it did wrong or I didn't like about it. It had much clearer and more focused vision, and I enjoyed the whole thing from front to back. The Four Worlds, I liked all the tracks except for two, which I thought were just okay, but more importantly, just doesn't come together as neatly as a complete whole. I mean, I suppose if I wanted to stretch and take the title more literally, I suppose there may be 4 different styles implemented on this album. Like, you could have the more straightforward house of Glasspops as the first world, more ambient and spooky stuff like Circle of Fear, Parkstone Melody 2, and the title track for the second world, the 2 experimental vocal tracks as the third world, and the Baroque-like and dramatic Arched Window and Men and Toll as for the fourth world. But that is a pretty big stretch. And this album just isn't long enough or ordered in such a way to properly solidify that was in fact what he was going for. As it is, the only way I can really interpret it is basically an album of leftovers from Under the Sun that didn't really fit well on there. Now, there is some good stuff to be found here for sure. I may not have been huge on the vocal tracks, but everything else was fine and good for what they were. I think if you really liked Under the Sun, this will probably be worth a shot. But if you hadn't already heard Under the Sun, definitely make sure you listen to that first, at the very least. It's just so much more well executed in general. The Four Worlds, to me, it's just a decent collection of tracks that's not super worth going out of your way for. I'm probably not going to be returning to it in the future. I mean, in a world with no shortage of enjoyable and interesting Mark Pritchard projects, this one's not essential. I think I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.